about a place that's very near and dear to my heart, Howe Sound, and to just share some positivity about community leadership and stewardship to protect ocean health and communities who live around the Salish Sea. So I'm going to share my screen now. Just give me a minute. Can you all see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, and let me just, so that I can see the video panel. All right, so the topic that I chose when I was asked to give this presentation, my mind kind of went all over the place, and I started going down some rabbit holes of ocean health and some complicated instances that I've been learning about over the last little while. And I think that's sort of reflected in this title, which when I looked back on it last week, I was like, oh, that seems a little bit dramatic. And there's no reference to ocean or to community in it. But I think that it was a bit of a reflection of my state of mind, which I'll kind of go into momentarily. But before going into the talk, of course, I want to acknowledge and express gratitude for the fact that I live and work and learn on the ancestral territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. And I thank the Squamish Nation in particular for teaching me a lot about the beauty and wonder of the region that I'm going to be speaking to you all about tonight, Howe Sound Átl'ța7tsem. And I invite you to share in the chat a little bit about whose territories you might be joining from this evening. I understand that there may be folks from different parts of the Salish Sea and maybe even from outside of the Pacific Northwest. So I'd love to just make this as interactive and as, chatty a presentation as possible so that we can kind of feel like we're in the same room together. Okay, so before we zoom into this place, I want us to just kind of think about what the ocean is experiencing right now. And as I mentioned, that title of trying to heal in this era of a rising tide of global collapse, well, that is the reality of the ocean in many parts of the world right now. Oceans are under extreme pressure from a number of different human activities and threats. We have up in our top left corner of this slide, a bottom trawl, which is quite a destructive and non-selective type of fishing that's kind of contributing to a lot of collapse of ecological systems. In our top right, we have a bleached coral reef, which is an outcome of climate change, and climate change has a whole bunch of different ways that it impacts ocean ecosystems. We have the melting ice caps, sea level rise, ocean warming and acidification. And then the bottom two pictures illustrate perhaps some of the most striking and visible pressures or impacts that humans have on the ocean, which is through pollution and plastics. So as a young person who studies marine conservation, this can all be very overwhelming. And sometimes when I'm hit with these visuals and these facts about the decline in ecosystem health, I get kind of upset, I get overwhelmed, and I don't really know even where to start to make change happen. And that's tricky because in general, I try to be kind of an optimistic and a solutions-oriented person, but it is the reality. And so over the past few years, something that has given me solace and comfort in confronting these realities is my work in Howe Sound Átl'ța7tsem, and is my work with communities. I found it to be very grounding and very energizing to learn and work with community groups in forming and implementing solutions that protect ocean health and build this region's resilience to the whole host of pressures that we're experiencing right now and that we're going to continue to experience over the years to come. So tonight, I'm going to introduce 3 case studies that embody some of these community-led stewardship values in marine conservation. And my goal is for you to walk away with a really clear sense of hope and optimism and commitment to strengthening your connection to places that you care about, so that we can all become better stewards and improve our capacity to protect the health of our ocean and of the communities that connect with healthy oceans. So the case studies I mentioned, they all gravitate around one central theme or mantra, which guides a lot of the work that I do as a researcher. And that theme is collaboratively create and connect knowledge to action. So collaborative creation, that means that we're trying to include all of the different groups in our area who connect with and who access and value ocean spaces. So that might be governments, First Nations, industry groups, recreationists, residents. We want to bring everybody together. And then we want to create knowledge and make sure that it connects to action. So I do believe that researchers have a responsibility, especially those who are studying biodiversity and climate change, to connect the work that we're doing to some sort of outcome, whether it's conservation or education or policy. I really think it's important to try to strive towards connecting those dots. And the 3 case studies that I'm going to speak to all orient around this place that I've mentioned, Howe Sound Átl'xa7tsem, and here's a map of it down here. It's a deep water fjord nestled in the Salish Sea. And the 3 case studies will involve one that's based in maps, one that orients around eelgrass, which is this beautiful plant, subtidal plant, and one that is oriented around herring. But before going into those case studies, I thought I'd just kind of take a moment to share the story of Howe Sound Átl'xa7tsem's ocean history. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to walk us through a little bit about what's happened in this region over the last around century and a half to the ocean here, and introduce you to some of the people who live in this area. So as I mentioned, Howe Sound is a deep water fjord that's nestled in the heart of the Salish Sea. And many of you on the call will know the Salish Sea is the inland sea that stretches across the Canadian and the American border. And the line in blue on this slide is outlining all of the fresh watersheds that are flowing into this area. So we have one thing that I think is really important when we're talking about ocean spaces is to acknowledge, and talking about conservation and collaboration and everything, is to acknowledge that the water is incredibly connected. So a salmon, for example, that's leaving the Squamish estuary has to swim throughout all of Howe Sound, through the Strait of Georgia. It might cross over to the American waters in Puget Sound before swimming out into the North Pacific Ocean. So it's crossing all of these boundaries. It doesn't really care about lines on a map. It just wants to get to where it goes and then come back to spawn. And so when we're working in water spaces, we want to try to keep in mind that continuity and that flow across jurisdictions. And on Canada's side of the border, jurisdictions are super complex here. We have incredible overlap between the First Nations, federal, provincial, and local governments. So any work in ocean spaces does mandate that we're working across different stakeholder and rights holder groups. So I just thought I'd kind of put that out there in the get-go. I mentioned that Átl'xa7tsem, Howe Sound, is in the heart of the Salish Sea, but it is also in the heart of the Squamish Nation's territory. So this whole region falls within the nation's territory, the Squamish Nation's territory, and overlaps with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, the Musqueam Nation, Sechelt, and Lil'wat Nation's territories. And this is a picture of a Squamish Nation elder, Linda Williams, who's looking out from the Stoutmas Reserve up in Squamish. And I thought I'd just kind of share some lessons that I've learned through my work with the Squamish Nation over the past few years that have kind of shaped the way that I perceive my role in marine conservation. And it has to do with language. So first of all, as a settler, as a white settler, I grew up interacting with landscape features in this area that have were named after European explorers for the most part. Howe Sound was named after a general, and there's features like Garibaldi Mountain that were named after an Italian military expeditionist. And many of these people never even visited Howe Sound, let alone Canada. So they never stepped foot in this country. Yet these remarkable features are named after them, which is kind of confusing. So over the last few years, I've been learning the Squamish Nation place names for these areas. And the nation actually has 3 place names for Howe Sound, one of which is Átl'xa7tsem, which means paddling from Squamish out towards the Strait of Georgia and the Salish Sea. And that is because the nation used to, and still does, use the Sound as a transportation route and as a place to canoe. And so it kind of carries that meaning. And I've learned that a lot of the place names and the language is it's kind of very connected with the land and the water. For example, the directions in the Squamish Nation language have to do with coming out of the water or going towards the water rather than up and down or out and in. So it has that deep connectivity with land and water spaces. And I would love for our regions to respect those place names and to bring them forward increasingly. Another language lesson that I learned a couple of years ago from Squamish Nation youth was considering how we refer to and perceive the more than human natural world that we love. So, for example, when we think of salmon and trees and forests, I used to think of those as resources, natural resources that are managed by different government entities. But in a workshop, one of the Squamish Nation youth that I work with said, no, these are life, these are relatives, these are, beings with their own intrinsic value. And that's really shifted the way that I'm kind of going about my work now, and the way that I see myself as a human and human societies interacting with nature. A lot of conservation has tried to exclude humans from nature, and a lot of development has tried to do that as well. And I really hope that we can move towards a approach that is not excluding, rather making sure that we're living together more holistically, and that we're respecting our role as one of many species on this earth that has a disproportionate impact. And we should work to remediate that. So those are a few of the lessons that I've learned from the Squamish Nation through my work. And yeah, I just want to extend gratitude towards them and acknowledge the territory that I'm working within. Okay, so if you were to visit Howe Sound at Átl'xa7tsem today, you would probably experience a region that is thrumming with life. There's tons of activity on the water. There's so much recreation. There's tons of different industrial activity. And if you go underwater, you'll likely to encounter a whole bunch of different iconic marine species of the Pacific Northwest. So the pulse of life is really coming back in this region, and it's quite strong right now. But I said coming back, which means that it had gone for a little while. And if it's true, if you had traveled to the Sound, 50 years ago, or even maybe 30 or 40 years ago, and definitely 100 years ago, it was a completely different place. The Sound was heavily impacted by a number of different industrial activities. For example, we had the Britannia copper mine, which operated from 1904 to 1974, and was one of the worst point sources of metal contamination in all of North America. So the water that was leaching from this mine was very acidic, and it severely contaminated the Sound's water quality. We also had a few different pulp and paper mills. We had a chemical plant up in Squamish, and then there was intensive log booming and storage and forestry all throughout the Sound. And all of these industrial activities layered upon one another to really damage ecological health, so that if you travel to this region during the 20th century, a lot of people just referred to the Sound as stinky and an empty place that was sort of devoid of marine life. So it was really not a healthy spot. But thankfully, over the last few decades, the industry has transformed a lot of its behavior and incorporated best practices or shut down. And we've begun to see a return in marine life that some people are calling the Great Recovery, or like the Howe Sound return of resurgence of life. And it's really inspiring. We see marine mammals such as the orca, the transient orca that you just saw a video of. I actually saw them for the first time last week when we were out on the Sound for a plankton survey, which was really inspiring. And this return of marine mammals is leading to a huge upsurge in community engagement and inspiration and connection to the ocean, which I think makes sense. I think a lot of us connect with marine mammals because they are the bigger ones. And yeah, we have a talk coming up after me on humpbacks, so I'm excited to learn more about their return in the Salish Sea. But what's also really exciting about marine mammals is it means that the food that they eat is also probably in a healthier state, because they tend to be up here at the top of the food web, and they eat different things, maybe salmon, maybe forage fish, maybe plankton. But if they're around, it means that there's enough food to support them. They've come here for a reason. And in the Sound, we have been seeing a return and an increase in the amount of forage fish throughout the region. In particular, over the past few years, we've seen a number of northern anchovy, which I don't believe that have been a very common forage fish in this region before. And I mentioned at the beginning herring, so I'll be speaking more to the herring later on in this talk. So this is exciting. We had this like industrial degradation, and now we're seeing a recovery. But of course, there's a whole new onslaught of pressures that we're now experiencing. And this photo kind of encapsulates some of that, those looming threats. So we have the city of Vancouver here. Here's downtown and Stanley Park, North Vancouver, and here's Howe Sound. So this is kind of looking out into the islands, Anvil Island, Gambier, over there's West Howe Sound, Bowen Island, and this is the sea to sky corridor that you drive up to get up to Squamish. So you can see how close Howe Sound is to this like growing metropolis of Vancouver. And this is leading to quite a substantial spillover effect. We're seeing a ton of people come into the Sound, especially with COVID last year, to visit, to recreate, to enjoy and connect with nature. And also a lot of people who are moving to this area. So this map on our left shows population change from 2006 to 2011. And you can see that the district of Squamish grew at a rate of 11 to 15%, which made it one of the fastest growing municipalities in Canada at that time. We're also seeing a huge spike in visitation to parks. So over 2 million people visited BC parks in 2014 to 15, which was 50% higher than the previous year period. And since then, that's already 6 years ago. I'm sure it's just gone up. So we've shifted our pressures in a way of like the industrial pressures are still there, but they're slightly smaller and different. But we're really seeing this increase and this upsurge in coastal development and all of the pressures that accompany that. And then, of course, there's another lurking pressure, which is climate change. So at this point, I feel like I'd like to invite you to reflect a little bit on how you've experienced climate change over the last maybe 5 to 10 years. Have you observed changes in the abundance of plants and animals around you, in the timing of different seasonal events, like when plants bloom or when animals appear? For me, it was the forest fire smoke. And I think for a lot of people living in the Lower Mainland or in BC and along the West Coast, forest fires have really dominated our communities in the summer for the past several years. So this is a photo that I took in 2019, August of 2019, looking out up the Sound on the ferry over to Bowen Island. And this is 1 year previous in the same exact position, and you can barely see the mainland from the ferry because the dense smog. And then this is a photo last year of that same period when we had a couple weeks of dense smoke, which compounded with COVID to just make for a really stressful time that I'm sure you can all relate to. So I like to during these periods of dense forest fire smoke, I've kind of made the connection of, okay, we're changing our air so much that like the air we breathe is toxic. And this is kind of what's happening in the ocean, where there's so many changes that are happening to the seawater chemistry due to carbon emissions that it's changing, it's shifting, it's becoming warmer, it's becoming more acidic, and that's all leading to a very different environment that a lot of marine animals are actually quite vulnerable to. So for example, shellfish and any plankton and invertebrates who create calcified carbonate shells, they are dissolving in water that's becoming more acidic. And that has a whole host of knock-on effects for economic and social and cultural communities that depend on shellfish for aquaculture, for example, or for cultural harvesting. So we're seeing these effects and we're feeling them, and there's tons of analogies between how we experience climate change and what's happening in the ocean, but it's definitely impacting life in the Sound. And I mentioned kind of at the beginning, we had the industrial degradation and then the recovery and now these new pressures, but not all of the marine ecosystem is doing so well. And we have a number of species whose abundance in the Sound is quite low relative to other areas on their coast. For example, lingcod and rockfish are two groups of fish whose abundance is really low in the Sound, probably due to overfishing. And then we have marine birds a number of marine birds are kind of in a concerning state, and other species like glassband reefs that are just very fragile and delicate and also vulnerable to climate change pressures. So it's important for us to kind of keep in mind this, like, okay, we can celebrate a little bit, but there is a lot of work to do. And we're kind of at this tipping point where, if we don't proactively plan to protect the health of our ecosystems, then we might return to that degraded state. So at this point, that's kind of the brief overview of the ocean history in this area. And we've arrived at our present reality. We're at that tipping point. And now I'd like to kind of dive into that first case study where communities in this area, governments, and different stakeholder groups who connect with the ocean have unified around this project called the Átl'xa7tsem Marine Reference Guide, which is creating maps about the region's ocean in order to inform marine spatial planning and community education to support that proactive planning process. So this project came out of a report that was published in 2017 called the Ocean Watch Howe Sound Report, which kind of reported on the status of various ecological and human use indicators associated with the Sound's ocean. And it's available online. I'll pop in a bunch of links at the end of this chat, of this talk, if you guys want to explore those after this evening. But the Ocean Watch report was really neat because in addition to kind of summarizing all of this data, it came with an action plan for local governments to take and had 10 actions in it that were really clear and simple that local governments in the area could implement in order to protect ocean health. And the first action was to create a guide that brings together information about the area's water, including the ocean and the fresh water that flows into it, into a tool that would support marine spatial planning and just help governments work across their boundaries into that more holistic and regional planning process. So that is how this project came into being, and I've been involved in it for the last few years. And it's been a really neat opportunity to understand how maps can be a tool to help unveil what's happening below the surface and really show people what human activities take place in the ocean, where do plants and animals live, and where do those things overlap. So I find maps there to be a great tool. They have their problems, of course, but in general, they're a really great visualization. And this project's goal is to use them to use other tools to build capacity to protect, restore, and be stewards of the diverse natural and human values associated with the Sound's ocean. So at this point, I'm going to show you what this map looks like. So we have uploaded it into our website, and I'll actually just pop the link in the chat right now. And oh yeah, nice comments on the climate change impacts. I'll go back and respond to the chat stuff if we have time at the end of the talk. It could be nice to have a little bit of a Q&A. But yeah, so the map is up in our website, howesoundguide.ca/map, and it contains over 300 different data layers that you can click on and off in order to kind of visualize how they overlap in space and how they interact. So here we have a video that I hope is clear enough on your computers. And I'm just going to sort of show you how to interact with the map and how to navigate and find different data layers. So we categorized the data layers into different groups: ecology, human use, etc. And under all of the categories, you can see there's subcategories, so plants, animals, you name it. So here I'm just kind of clicking on and off the eelgrass layer, and you can see it in pink on the map. And this is also a great way to visualize, where eelgrass is and where eelgrass isn't in the region. We also have categories like pollution, and tenures, which I'm putting on now. And for all of these data, it can get quite colorful and tons of information in there. You can break down what the different colors are in the map, or you can click the actual data layer and read more about it. But yeah, our goal is for this information to support planning and also to support education for anybody who wants to just learn more about what exists in this area. We've also put in a number of different data layers from the province and from the federal government, as well as from the Squamish Nation. So we recently put in the Squamish Nation place names into the map, which is really great. And then the map links to other reports and initiatives around the Sound. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. We host whole training workshops on the map. So if anybody's interested in learning more about it, then I'm happy to speak with you outside of this this afternoon. But that kind of gives you a little bit of an understanding of what's in the map. Now I thought I would just kind of walk through. I mentioned glass sponge reefs, which are some of the really incredible and unique and fragile creatures that live in the Sound. Howe Sound is actually the only place in the world where you can access these reefs by diving. Glass sponges were thought to have gone extinct in the dinosaur era, but recently they were rediscovered in Howe Sound and elsewhere along the British Columbia's coast. And now it's really great because the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has recently announced a series of different fisheries closures to try to protect these glass sponge reefs. As their name implies, they build their skeleton out of silica, which is the same as glass. So they're quite fragile to any impact, such as any fishing gear that's dropped on them or any anchors or moorages if they're in those areas. And here in the map, I just wanted to kind of create this video to show how the map can visualize what's underwater. So we have the bathymetry outlined here, and then I'm just turning on the glass sponge reef distribution so we can see that there's a bunch of reefs that have been found along this arm of the sound and the protected areas that surround the reefs in black. And then I also show kind of the other marine invertebrates that live in this area, such as sea urchins. Now they're popping up. And for all of the data layers, you can kind of click to see any sort of metadata. So these data came from OceanWise's research group, who's been doing dive surveys in Howe Sound for decades now and has incredible databases. And then now what I just popped up is the distribution of marine mammal sightings, which is another database that OceanWise manages, where you can kind of learn about and document and share any sort of marine mammal observations. Okay. Here's a map that shows those recent glass sponge reef protections, the fisheries closures that were announced a few last year, and then there's upcoming ones to be protected, the dark red ones in the coming months. So we look forward to hearing some positive news from DFO on protecting the glass sponge reefs in the next little while. Another really important part of this project is we really wanted to document community values and perspectives. So I mentioned at the beginning of this project that a lot of my energy and enthusiasm is like drawn from working with different community groups in this area. And I want to make sure that the work that we're doing is reflective of the knowledge that community members hold about the ocean, and that knowledge is actually feeding into these decision support tools. So rather than just creating a map that's pulling together databases that governments already have or scientific surveys that different entities have conducted, we also wanted to interview and to conduct surveys and workshops with people who live in the area so that their knowledge is also feeding into this map. And we're in that process right now, and we're really excited to be collaborating with researchers at the University of British Columbia and with the Squamish Nation on this work so that we can make sure it's a really good process that respects the nation's rights and titles in this region and also informs and supports their marine use planning process. So that's kind of an overview of the first case study. We have a community that's concerned about ocean health, that really wants to proactively protect it and increase its ability to work across government boundaries and collectively make good decisions to protect ocean health using tools. Super great. Our second case study is now going to focus on a marine plant that I didn't know anything about until a few years ago. And since learning about it, I've really just fallen in love with it because it's pretty incredible. And that is eelgrass. So I understand that last week, or maybe the week before that, Patrick Martone introduced you to a bunch of seaweeds, but eelgrass differs from seaweeds in the fact that it is actually a vascular flowering plant that has evolved to live in the ocean from the land. So like land plants, it has roots, and these roots play a really important role in increasing the value of this plant to humans for a number of different reasons, most notably in a climate change context. So seagrasses are one of several coastal habitat forming species that play a really strong role in sequestering carbon into the ocean, so storing carbon. And they do that when they photosynthesize, they take up carbon and then they store it in their roots and it moves into the sediment and it stays there. Whereas seaweeds, they don't have roots, they have holdfasts, and then when they die, they kind of drift out into the water and decompose and the carbon is released back into the ecosystem. So seagrasses, salt marshes, and mangroves are the three main coastal habitat species that are really important in a climate change context. In addition to this service, though, of sequestering carbon, eelgrass provides incredible habitat to hundreds of different fish and invertebrate species that then support other species who eat those, such as marine birds and bigger fish. And in the Salish Sea, there's over 400 species that have been documented in a meter squared of eelgrass. So that's pretty incredible They also can stabilize sediments and contribute to reduced erosion along the shorelines and help to improve water quality by recycling nutrients. So collectively, all of these features and services that they provide mean that in the Salish Sea, 1 hectare of seagrass can provide up to $87,000 in ecosystem services per year. So that's pretty immense. And if you'd like to learn more about that statistic and the reports behind it, feel free to visit oceanwatch.ca. That's the report that I referenced at the beginning of this talk. Unfortunately, however, there's a sad side to this story, and it's that seagrasses globally are one of the fastest declining ecosystems. So since the 1880s, we've lost 30% of our total seagrass habitat area, which is pretty bad. And it's projected that over the years to come, we'll have an annual loss of seagrass habitat of 1.5%. And studies in the Salish Sea have come up with really similar numbers. In a study along the Gulf Islands, they found that seagrass habitats declined by 35% over the course of 20 or 30 years. And we found similar changes in the town of Gibson eelgrass when we did some mapping there recently. So it's concerning, and we need to make sure that we're drawing attention towards ways that we can protect seagrasses. But in order to protect something, we have to know why it's being pressured, like what are the pressures that are impacting it in the first place. And for eelgrass in Howe Sound and the Salish Sea, the pressures fall into 2 main categories. First, we have climate change, and second, we have coastal development. So climate change impacts seagrasses by changing the water conditions, like the temperature. Seagrasses don't really like warm temperatures much. It alters the salinity, the saltiness, and the acidity, and all of that can pressure it. But climate change also leads to more intense winter storms, and I think that has quite a significant negative impact on eelgrass beds in areas that get really high wave exposure. Coastal development is another one that is perhaps a little bit easier for us to tackle more quickly through local actions. And I'll kind of spend some time elaborating on that right now. So in this picture, we have an aerial view of a bay, and all of the little white dots are boats. And if you can see the color below the boats, there's dark green here, and then there's these like lighter green circles. So the dark green is an eelgrass bed. And eelgrass beds are best at providing good habitat when they're continuous and when they're lush meadows, as we would see in any sort of terrestrial grasslands. But unfortunately, the boats are leading to holes forming in this continuous eelgrass bed. And so it's leading to that habitat fragmentation and degrading the ability for eelgrass to provide good habitat. And the reason for the holes is because your traditional mooring with like a block and a chain up to the mooring, the float on the surface, when the tide goes up and down, that chain rubs along and scrapes the seafloor and effectively removes all the creatures that live around that block. And so that's why you end up with these weird halos around the boat moorings. But thankfully, humans are pretty smart and innovative, and we've already come up with a design for mooring buoys that is more environmentally friendly and that reduces that seafloor scraping, which we call benthic scouring. So this design involves having a midline float that hoists the cable or the rope off the seafloor and means that tugging with the tide going up and down occurs in the water column rather than on the seafloor. So it's a really simple way of just reducing our footprint. You can still have safe moorage. Ideally, you're mooring outside of eelgrass growth, but if there's no safe moorage at those depths, which in the Salish Sea, it's around below 7 meters chart datum, you'll be pretty certain to be out of the eelgrass habitat. If you can't do that, then you can use this design. And we've already started to install some of those mooring floats in Howe Sound and elsewhere throughout the Salish Sea through a restoration project that is led by the Sea Change Marine Conservation Society. And I'll pop their information in the chat at the end of this talk as well. So Sea Change does a ton of different nearshore restoration in the region. And they trained me and a few others how to do eelgrass mapping a few years ago. So I mentioned that if you want to protect something, you have to understand what the pressures are. If you want to restore something, you also have to know what the pressures are and make sure that they've been removed. You also want to know, if you go to a bay and you don't see any eelgrass, you want to know whether there was any eelgrass there to begin with, or if it's just a place that it was, if it's a place that it was never there, or if it was there and it was removed due to pressures. So in Howe Sound, there was no baseline data. Baseline data is that like first record of where a species was and how much of it there was, essentially. There was no baseline data for eelgrass distribution along the mainland coastline. So we surveyed this in 2019 to kind of fill that knowledge gap. And then since doing those surveys, we're really excited because that information is already informing different management plans and in the nearshore water that local governments are doing in this area. So for example, in the town of Gibsons, we have already seen them incorporate this information into their harbor management plan, and they are moving towards implementing some really great eelgrass conservation projects. We're also seeing this happen on Bowen Island, and we hope that this can kind of scale up. I'm a big fan of the idea that, you know, if one community is doing something positive for ocean health, we want to make sure we're communicating the way that they did that to other communities who want to, so that we're not reinventing the wheel every time that we see a problem and want to fix it. So this is a really great initiative, the implementation of protecting eelgrass in nearshore waters by local governments and working with different community groups and boaters to make sure that we're spreading that awareness about where eelgrass is. Sea Change also does restoration in the area, and the restoration involves eelgrass transplants, subtidal debris removals, and marine riparian restoration, when you're kind of replanting the land right next to the sea in order to restore the habitat integrity. And the cool thing about the way that Sea Change does their restoration work is they actually talk to communities who live in the area and ask them where they think the restoration should occur, rather than just going and looking at the ecological surveys and being like, okay, this would be a good place. The reason why this is so important is because restoration is time and labor intensive, and it doesn't always succeed. And so you want to make sure that we're doing the best that we can to make sure it succeeds. And by listening to communities, we can get a really good sense of what's happening in that body of water. What is the level of activity? Who's living on the foreshore? Are they willing to engage in stewardship behaviors? Are they interested in protecting ecosystem health here? And if those answers are yes, then that area is much more likely to be successful, because people will be on board. They'll want to kind of tend to their marine gardens, and they'll be more likely to support restoration and monitoring going forward. So we've had a lot of success in Howe Sound with engaging community groups and rallying people around this eelgrass restoration work. And it's been super energizing and rewarding for me to be involved in that, because yeah, it's boots on the ground. You're actually planting the plants, and it's overall great. But I definitely have to have the caveat that restoration work, we don't want to be working towards restoration, right? Like ideally, we're not damaging habitats so much that we need to restore them. Ideally, we're protecting them proactively so that we don't have to do that restoration. But that's just kind of a philosophical aside. So my third and final case study is about herring and culture and Chemish in Howe Sound. And Chemish is the Squamish Nation word for herring eggs, herring roe. And this is a really amazing project that is quite recent, over the past few months, that involves citizen science and intergenerational knowledge transfer. So essentially, kind of at that turning point when the Sounds Ocean was going from this degraded, unhealthy state into a healthier state, part of the recovery involved some restoration work that citizen scientists up in Squamish did to improve herring spawning habitat. And what this group did, the Squamish Streamkeepers, is they wrapped creosote pilings with a fabric. Creosote is a tar preservative that is used to coat wood pilings to make sure that they don't degrade in the ocean. But unfortunately, creosote is incredibly toxic. So any herring that were laying eggs on the creosote pilings, those eggs were dying. So the streamkeepers observed this, and they decided to wrap the pilings in fabric so that the eggs were being laid on the fabric rather than the creosote. And that helped to improve survival rates. And so now we're seeing an increasing return of herring spawn in the Sound. And in fact, 2 years ago, the Squamish Nation held their first traditional harvest in years of herring roe of Chemish. Unfortunately, however, some of the citizen scientists are getting a bit older. And so the younger generation in the Sound, we decided that it was time for us to kind of start to learn and continue on the work that they've been doing to not only protect spawning habitat, but also just research the spawn and understand when it's happening and where it's happening and why. So this past herring spawning season, which in the Sound lasts from around February to April, I worked with a number of different young people here, including youth from the Squamish Nation, the Marine Reference Guide, and educators up in Squamish who work with elementary school programs that have place-based learning called Cultural Journeys. And we learned about the citizen science training protocols and kind of copied them to do the herring surveys and to understand and document where the herring are spawning. So this was a pretty incredible work. And importantly, we hope that it kind of fits within the broader context of herring recovery in the Salish Sea. There's other areas such as like the Tsleil-Waututh Nation is doing a herring restoration project, and there's tons of herring spawn activity in the Strait of Georgia with the commercial fisheries. So it seems like there's a lot of attention around this forage fish, which is really great and encouraging because the species at the bottom of the food web don't always get the same attention in media that, you know, the charismatic orcas and the humpback whales do. So I like kind of getting in touch and jumping on the bandwagon of the less charismatic species like the invertebrates and the forage fish. And another really meaningful part of this process is that Squamish Nation youth were leading it, and that's brought in so much incredible culture and sense of community to the project. So yeah, it's just been a really wonderful, positive learning experience for me. We've been sharing reports through social media. So like the whole House and Squamish community is able to kind of get on board, and there's been so much enthusiasm and appreciation for young people going out and continuing and kind of like carrying the torch and getting out on the land and waters. So I hope that this continues on and encourages to inspire the next generation of citizen scientists. So that kind of brings my talk to a close. And I want to leave you just with these key reflections of the core themes that I've been discussing tonight. So the first is that really important need to make sure that the knowledge that we're creating and the knowledge that we have about natural systems, I don't like whether it's forests or oceans, it doesn't matter. We try to share that knowledge and make sure that we're connecting it to some sort of tangible positive outcome that will help to protect these places. Again, whether that's education or policy or community communications, or it doesn't matter. It's just I hope that people continue to work towards sharing knowledge as much as they can and translating it to positive outcomes. Another core theme is connection to place. So I didn't mention this at the beginning of the talk, but I grew up in Vancouver and I spent a lot of my childhood on Bowen Island, Átl'ța7tsem, and I absolutely credit that to my passion and commitment to be working in this space and to be working in this area and with this community. And I think that the more that we can make sure that people, especially at a young age, are exposed to nature and really grow that connection to place, then we'll be able to better strengthen our regional and our community's abilities to protect places in the face of these really intense and scary and oppressive pressures that our societies and our nature are experiencing. And the final key take home is the power of community and collaboration. Everything that I talked about today involved all of these groups and more. So it takes a village to do this type of work. Conservation cannot be done by one person or by one entity. It really involves people working all throughout different groups or areas of society and governments and stakeholders, nonprofits, industry. We really need everybody to come on board and make sure that we're paddling in the right direction towards positive outcomes for the ocean. So I say a thank you to everybody on this slide and to all of the people who are not on this slide. I thank you all for listening to me tonight. And yeah, I think I finished a little bit early. So I don't know if there's any people who have questions or if there's room for some sort of dialogue right now. Yeah, thank you very much.
We do have time for questions if anyone wants to ask anything. And I will moderate the chat here for you.
I'll pop in those some hyperlinks right now too, just so that people can I don't know, open them up on your computers right now. So Howe Sound Guide, that's the Marine Reference Guide's website if you'd like to learn more about the mapping project. This is the website for the Ocean Watch report, which had that action plan that local governments are taking to protect ocean health. Here is another, oopsies. There's another, oh, I had two of the same link up there, whoopsies. Here is Sea Change's website, and they are the group who is leading the nearshore restoration. And I saw a few people asking how they can get involved. So you can email me. So here's my email. Feel free to shoot me a message, and I would love to connect to better understand what you're interested in doing. You can also follow different groups on social media if you have Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. And yeah,